Well, it's November the 4th, and all these beds have had plenty of time to recolonize some in the soil. And I've been looking at how everything's doing. I actually checked everything yesterday. And I've been finding some problems, so I've been in correspondence with the Morel King. And the problem I'm finding is what you can see here. Actually, let me a little bit of a shovel here, where I pulled the plastic back on this bed of Americana. If I scrape the soil back, you can see that, for one, there's no nice fluffy white or grayish mycelium that you would find with the morels. And all the pictures that I've seen from Morel King of his beds colonizing, there should be quite a bit of fluffy mycelium growing up through the top. And of course you see here too, there's lots of, a bit of grass and other lawn vegetation that survived the rototiller. But over here too, I see a good bit of green mold on the spawn, and here and there I see a little bit of fly activity too, where they've got in there because there's mold, and then the mold spawns some bacteria that the flies like. So why is it like that? And truthfully, I've gone through all of these beds, and I'll show you down here in the garden beds too. They're having the same problems, because if you remember, this bed right here, the Americana, was the first bed I made, so it should have the best spawn, the freshest spawn. And all the bags that I used in this bed were clean. Well, maybe a couple weren't, but I've checked it throughout, it's the same. And then even all the bags that I used in the Importuna bed at the very end, even though they were clean, all of them, they still have mold problems too. So let's go check that out first too, before I get to explaining why this is happening. Here's the bed that I made with all the Importuna spawn that appeared to be 100% clean when I put it in. But if you see the bed, here's mold that's crept up through it. Over here you can see a large patch of green trichoderma mold. And where I've scraped this back, where the Americana and other beds still looked a bit rough, and the spawn itself, where there was no regrowth, at least with the Impo, I'm getting regrowth. And actually in one day, yesterday, where I scraped this back, is already regrown into the soil. I can see new mycelium, so that's a good sign. But why is this happening? Well, it has to do with mold contamination in my spawn. I go through the, I'm doing petri dishes to liquid culture to grain spawn and then to sawdust spawn, which is a lot of transfers, from culture to the end. But, that's standard for what I would do with oyster mushrooms. But morels aren't oyster mushrooms, of course. Now, what I've learned from the Morel King is that while oysters can defend themselves against mold contamination decently, obviously if you have a bad mold contamination, those oyster mycelium is going to succumb to the mold. But oyster mushrooms have their own defense for it, so that kind of keeps the numbers down, and that's why you can get away with clean oyster cultures in a a home lab setting. Now Morel spawn's a bit different because Morel mycelium doesn't have any of the defenses that the oyster myceliums have. So when you have any kind of mold with it, there goes a big millipede. When you have any kind of mold spores in it, they're going to eventually germinate and creep up and start competing with the Morel mycelium. When Morel King makes his sawdust spawn, he inoculates it actually from agar wedges. So he's skipping all the in-between steps. And that's a good idea because then the Morel mycelium is going to have the least amount of cell divisions, is going to be the strongest and thrive the best. Because, you know, like I said before, it's not going to compete against the mold, you know, fight against it, so its only hope is to outrace it and eat all the food up in the sawdust bag before the mold gets to it. So what I'm going to have to do, starting with these Americana beds, is probably going to be a lot of work, is open up one side of it, go down the line, and take a hand hoe and scrape off any of the mold that I see growing up through the top. And of course, if I see any of it, you know, deep in the bed, there's really not a whole lot I can do about that because it's going to be kind of intermixed there. But Morel King says on some of the first projects that he did years ago, they had some mold issues, and some of them where he left the mold on top still produced a little bit of production of morels, but the ones that he scraped the mold off the top had quite a bit of an improvement. So I might as well do all that to my beds and make sure I get as much production as I can get. And then next year I'll be going to just using some agar wedges to inoculate the sawdust instead of doing all the grain spawn and liquid cultures. And I don't necessarily think my liquid culture is contaminated, although it could be. You know, it's hard to tell. But we'll take a look at that too. I got one of those left. Also too, if I dig any of this moldy spawn out, I have a bucket of fresh dirt to patch it up with. And then I'll throw the plastic back over it and the shade cloth back over that again, and resume everything as normal with my mist system come spring. Something else too about these beds up here on the hill, you can see where I got some standing water from the rains we've had these past few days. So I need to take a pickaxe and dig a few trenches down this hill to let that water out, because the beds do have to drain. Looks like only where the soil on top is shallow, like at the very top of my row, do I see the mold creeping up to the surface. You can see this importuna row. It looks pretty clean on top. I can see some vegetation just starting to make little seedlings there, you can see. But if I scrape it back, let's see. I mean, that looks pretty good. Yeah, see though there, see all that material back there? That's mold. So I think for the most of it, I'm just gonna have to cross my fingers and mist it in the spring, and hopefully I'll get some production to make this first year's experimentation worthwhile. And you know, so you know, I'm not bummed by this. Everything I do, I consider experimentation. I love making the videos. So if something goes wrong, that's just an excuse to get more good information out there so you don't get it wrong. So that now that I know that Morel mycelium is much more susceptible to mold contamination than oyster mycelium, I really need to do some improvements to clean up my work area. And one of the things that Morel King suggested that I'm going to do is put some walls up on the side here. Probably just some white laminated plyboard, like shelving board. Something smooth that you can wipe down with alcohol and sanitize it. And I'll put one on the other side as well. And that will help prevent any side currents of contamination swirling in, because still about this area of the hood is a bit risky to do any work in. Another thing I want to do is replace this older laminar filter. You can see it's all orangey where the silicone was, kind of discolored through the time. A lot of bends in the middle, but that's really not so much an issue as the flow rate is much slower than these newer style HEPA filter models. This has more of a fabric material into it, and of course you can see, because it's like a cloth or I guess more of like maybe even a paper material, you can see where I've damaged it accidentally when I've had a jar slip from my hands and smack it. But still pretty in good shape. Before the end of this season, or end of this year rather, I'm going to take some paper and tape the openings of these up to keep them a bit cleaner as well. One last thing I'm going to do as well is use some metal tape and seal up this crack here, and then run metal tape at this crack at the bottom, because I'm sure there's still a slight bit of air that's getting out from back behind the flow hood and slipping in between, because it's not exactly flush in between there. And I'll be using all agar wedges straight to the sawdust bags. That way I'll be able to see any contamination on the dish, make sure it's absolutely clean, and it'll be as few of steps as possible. That way the mycelium will be nice and strong, have the fewest amount of cell divisions, and hopefully won't have any of these problems where I'm seeing mold in the bags before putting them out. And I bet too I'll be able to keep the bags for a full 8 weeks without seeing any issues inside.